Welcome to the Memory Library Subspace Network. Input inquiry now. Access granted.
Today is August 30th, 2024, and once again, sci-fi, especially Star Trek, has proven prescient. The notably darker, edgier series Deep Space Nine aired a two-part arc called Past Tense in 1995 that showed an increasingly dystopian American 21st century. August 30th through September 2nd, 2024, to be exact. In it, San Francisco experienced a crippling situation centered on the unhoused. Certain political policies and inactions spawned by the country's shift of the Overton window to the right turned the blame onto the people themselves. They outlawed, quote, homelessness and did armed sweeps of city streets by a militarized police force. Those without jobs, housing, or requisite identification were rounded up and incarcerated in what amounts to ghettos.
What is this place?
Sanctuary District.
21st century history is not one of my strong points. Too depressing.
It's been a hobby of mine. They made some ugly mistakes, but they also paved the way for a lot of things we now take for granted.
I assume this is one of those mistakes.
A bad one. By the early 2020s, there was a place like this in every major city in the United States.
Why are these people in here? Are they criminals?
No, people with criminal records weren't allowed in the sanctuary districts.
Then what do they do to deserve this?
Nothing. Just people. Without jobs or places to live.
So they get put in here?
Welcome to the 21st century, Doctor.
These were nothing more than cordoned-off areas run down and not touched by gentrification. The episode starkly portrays the class and wealth gap when Captain Benjamin Sisko and Dr. Julian Bashir, both men of color who have suffered a time-travel transporter accident, are separated from Chief Science Officer Jadzia Dax, who presents as a white woman, though in the same general area and conditions as her companions. They are discovered unconscious by two vastly different agents of society. Sisko and Bashir by San Francisco police/sanctuary district officers, and Dax by a passing businessman. The former are transported at gunpoint to the San Francisco Sanctuary District, where they're incarcerated and processed by the local government, offered the bare minimum of social services, then simply released into the ghetto to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, the latter is given shelter, food, clothing, and internet access, where she cleverly convinces the government that she's well off enough to be issued new ID and support. It turns out that Dax's benefactor is Chris Brenner, a famous and absurdly wealthy Silicon Valley elite. In parallel scenes, Dr. Bashir laments the lack of basic health care for the interned, especially for those suffering from easily treatable disease. At one point, the doctor gives a character who suffers from hypoglycemia a shot of the drug glucogen. In real life, that medication costs $25 in nearly every nation on the planet. In America, it costs $250. Sisko and Bashir struggle to survive the frequent violence within the sanctuary district, which usually occurs at the hands of police or those desperate for basic necessities. Dax, on the other hand, finds herself rubbing elbows with the other members of the 1% of the 1%, where they discuss both the condition of, quote, those people in the camps and political protests in France.
I hear you just came back from Christchurch.
Yes. Did a little skiing on Mount Cook.
You're lucky. We had to cancel our trip to the Alps this year because of the student protests in France.
I thought the neo-Trotskyists were going to put a stop to that.
They're not having any more luck than the Gaullists did.
Europe is falling apart.
Well, at least we don't have to worry about that kind of thing here.
The overarching theme is, of course, the lack of empathy, in case you've lost memory from being beaten over the head with it.
You were lucky the police didn't find you first. If they'd caught you on the street without ID, you might have ended up in a sanctuary district.
I thought they stopped doing that.
Why would they? It's the only way to keep those people off the streets.
Ben Sisko is, conveniently, a hobbyist of 21st century history and recognizes the date of their arrival as the beginning of a pivotal point in human events.
What is it?
That calendar over there, it says August 30th, 2024.
I'm not sure I understand.
You ever hear of the Bell Riots?
Vaguely.
It is one of the most violent civil disturbances in American history, and it happened right here.
As Sisko goes to wait in an absurdly long food line, a gang of predatory scavengers return to harass Bashir for his ration card. Reluctantly, Sisko intervenes to help Bashir before things could escalate in a way that could alter the timeline. Meanwhile, a concerned citizen sees the fight and rushes to help Sisko and Bashir, but for his trouble, the man falls victim to a Christ-like wound and dies. A short time later, the chaos spills over the entire district as the same group of hooligans, known as Ghosts, take advantage of a fight between a resident and a cop at the processing center. They take the employees hostage and barricade themselves within. Sisko and Bashir rescue the beaten officer to join the enclave in the center. The Ghost's aims are typically ill-devised, but Sisko and Bashir see an opportunity to hold together the timeline. You see, in their version of history, a community leader and organizer of the Sanctuary District named Gabriel Bell became a default representative of the desperate grievances of fellow residents. He kept the Ghosts inside the hostage crisis from retaliatory violence and formulated a plan to use the situation for social change.
We just can't think about ourselves. There are 10,000 people living in here.
Well, let them get their own hostages.
No, Gabe is right. This is an opportunity for us to be heard. To let people on the outside know exactly what's going on in here.
The zany mix-up at the heart of this story, thus, comes into focus as the man who was killed turns out to be the one and only Gabriel Bell. Ben Sisko is then forced to assume Bell's identity and carry out his actions as per the course of history. He narrows the scope of demands by the hostage takers to include the reinstatement of what they call the Federal Employment Act, essentially the equivalent of AmWorks in the American House of Cards series.
You want to make demands? I'll give you some demands. We tell them if they want the hostages back, they've got to shut down the sanctuaries.
And reinstate the Federal Employment Act.
Now, the idea that something like that happened in America in the 21st century could really only be a stand-in for the Affordable Care Act, a sweeping, society-changing piece of legislation that is both flawed and beneficial, but also minuscule compared to the progressive programs of the 20th century. I'm pretty sure that's the actual parallel that House of Cards was going for. But an act like that, as crucial to society as the New Deal or even the Great Society, is as anachronistic in this episode as the monetary system shifting to credits, the temperature being displayed exclusively in Celsius, the prohibition of using quadricycles on public sidewalks, or
Best ball club I ever saw? 99 Yankees, no doubt about it.
Get out of here. The 15 Kings could have taken them any day.
Come on.
Am I right?
It's up to you, Bill.
I don't think there's any question. The Kings. 15 was Buck Bokai's rookie year.
That's all they had going for them.
My Royals won it that year, FYI. The end of the hostage crisis comes when the military, likely the National Guard, stormed the building, guns ablaze, indiscriminately. Sisko, as Bell, took a bullet to save the same Sanctuary District cops that had booked them in the first place, winning the hearts and minds of the hostages. In Star Trek lore, this event, live-streamed around the world on the net, changed public opinion and, in turn, policy in America toward strengthening the social safety net. Bell is declared dead and becomes a martyr for social justice and progressive action. In a behind-the-scenes DVD feature, Deep Space Nine showrunner Ira Steven Behr recalls that a visit he made to Santa Monica inspired these episodes and their narrative. Quote, "It was a beautiful day. Behr remembered noticing homeless people everywhere and how tourists were, quote, walking past as if they were part of the scenery." Taking this idea to its inevitable conclusion, Behr and co-writer Robert Hewitt Wolfe imagined what a near future might look like where the homeless could just be fully ignored. Now, as an arc, this concept was incomplete, of course, so Behr thought back to the 1971 riot in New York's Attica prison, which was caused by inmates' demands for more humane living conditions being continually ignored by the authorities, among several other historical events. But even more sobering is just how accurate the story is to its setting. One headline from the non-profit news organization Democracy Now! Reads, quote, "Immigrant prisoners in California are on labor and hunger strike against their inhumane detention." A report from the beginning of the month stated that a group of migrants jailed at 2 private immigration and custom enforcement detention centers launched a labor and hunger strike protesting dire conditions and demanding fair wages for detained migrant workers. The hunger strikers also called for an end to the excessive use of solitary confinement at Mesa Verde and Golden State Annex, and for the facilities to be shut down. Many of the detained migrants and asylum seekers are only paid $1 a day to perform janitorial duties and other jobs at the facilities, which are operated by the private GEO group. The hunger strikers reportedly faced heavy retaliation for taking part in a peaceful protest. Also in August, the president of the University of California ordered all 10 satellite campuses to ban protest encampments, as well as wearing face masks, which is relatively dire in the age of pandemics. The order came months after students set off a nationwide uprising in solidarity with Gaza. Many schools cracked down on the peaceful protests, violently clearing encampments and suspending students who took part. They weren't even this harsh during Vietnam protests, even though Kent State did happen. In late July, California Governor Gavin Newsom ordered officials to begin removing encampments of unhoused people on state property and encouraged local officials to carry out similar sweeps. Newsom announced his executive order just weeks after the U.S. Supreme Court voted to criminalize sleeping on public property, land of the free. The organization Human Rights Watch accused the city of Los Angeles of implementing a, quote, cruel, expensive, and ineffective policy of criminalizing unhoused people. The report says that the city's systematic sweeps on the dwellings of the unhoused only serve to remove them from public view and focus on punishment and quick fixes rather than addressing the dire housing and care needs that they face. One of those swept up recalled, quote, they woke us up in the morning telling us that they were going to do a clean sweep and to grab what we can and to get out because they were taking everything else. They took our food, they took all of our underclothes, they took all my shoes. They leave us with no resources, so we're stuck here until we can manage to get something to eat or clean water or whatever it is because they don't care. Now, as a result of Los Angeles' policies, death rates of the unhoused have skyrocketed, with an average of more than 6 unhoused people dying a day in LA County. A black person is 6 times more likely to be unhoused in LA than a white person. Take that for what you will. The situation is likely to get even worse following the Supreme Court ruling. Though that was a brief summary, this arc is a great Star Trek story in the vein of the original series episode City on the Edge of Forever, and a shining example of optimism in the face of dystopia that keeps Trek an enduring franchise. Now, not to be cynical, but while the story is scarily accurate in many of its predictions and timely in its contemporary commentary on disasters like Ruby Ridge and Waco, they fail to see the predictable effect deregulation would have on things like the news media and the detrimental effects the internet has had on the consumption of events. In the real 2024, the media sphere would produce a much different narrative than the one which emerged in this story. Right-wing media, which often rejects the ethics of genuine journalism, would spin such a nuanced and complex event into one that emphasized fear-mongering sensationalism and op-eds to distill the story into a binary issue in order to reinforce the bias of its base, at best to bolster its ratings and ad revenue, and at worst to further an intentional and craven socio-political economic project to expand and maintain a stratified society, a racially, religiously, and economically us-and-them world. Centrist media, even if their intention is actual journalism, is beset with issues of sensationalism and constant content creation to fill a 24-hour news cycle. This usually results in shortcuts in the journalistic process, often just repeating reporting from other sources and foregoing independent investigation and verification. Combine that with bad faith editorial decisions and disbanding of local journalism, and the result would likely be the parroting of police press releases and passing the buck on legwork. Center-left, or quote, liberal news organizations are still beholden to corporate overlords who dislike criticism of the status quo and who helped reshape news from a sacred pillar in society to a product designed to appeal to a market space, just like the right. Once again, they rely on opinion pieces over sincere journalism, even if their intention is to, at best, counter the narratives created by the same formats on the right. It feeds into a problem. Fighting fire with fire doesn't really work without an agreed-upon truth or a consensus of credibility. Whataboutism then becomes a default counteraction, and the real issues go unseen. Actual leftist news, especially those not motivated by profit, are thus marginalized and easily dismissed when not able to compete in the economy of attention. All of this means that in our 2024, the Bell Riots wouldn't be the galvanizing event it was written to be through the eyes of a less polarized era. The death of George Floyd, for instance, created a nationwide outrage and response, though the only real difference between that event and similar tragedies that occurred many, many times before and since was the number of eyes that saw it, and even then, little substantial social change resulted. Reactions by the powers that be often doubled down on the conditions that led to the situation. The right, center, and center-left used the suddenly mainstream critique of police militarization, police methods, and bias, rooting out issues of social inequity and correcting them, into pumping more resources into police. Instead of defunding them, they paid them more. It's quite Orwellian in the way calling out racism was labeled racist, and both passively and physically resisting violence was labeled violent crime. Sadly, Gabriel Bell would have been labeled a criminal, likely using racist dog whistles. Possibly even a domestic terrorist for trying to de-escalate and make good of a violent situation. But the fact that society seems to move more and more toward dystopia, with either the approval or the misinformed consent of the masses, is exactly why science fiction is important. And more than that, to keep the genre's allegorical warnings from cynically becoming the abyss into which we all stare, we need Star Trek. Both to show us how things might go, but to remind us that we have the ability to do better. Ira Stephen Bear.
Wow, how naive we were back then. That you could get the truth out and that everyone would hear the truth because it was the truth, that the simple fact that it's true meant that people would hear it. And now it's so much more complicated. Those people in that sanctuary district would have been demonized, and used for different purposes by so many different groups of people. It just was much more, life has become much more complicated, Every time they said that this was the event that changed everything, I thought to myself, if only we could have one event that could change everything, but somehow it never does,